Welcome back to my channel. Kindly watch and subscribe. The title of our story is The Boy Mocked for Silence Becomes the Voice of the Gods.
Long before the birth of Kofi, the village of Okrom was a small, peaceful place tucked in the hills, far from the bustling cities. It was a place where everyone knew each other's name, and the land was rich with lush green fields, dense forests, and a wide, winding river that brought life to the people. The air smelled of the wildflowers that grew in abundance, and the sounds of birds singing in the trees were a familiar melody. It was a village where people lived in harmony with nature and the gods, believing that the world around them was filled with spirits both kind and dangerous. But not all was well for Amora, the woman who longed for a child of her own. Amora had been married to Ibo for many years, but despite their love for one another, the joy of raising a child had eluded them. For years, Amora had visited every healer, every wise woman, every spiritual leader, hoping for a solution to her barrenness, but nothing had worked. The villagers began to whisper that perhaps it was her fault, that the gods were punishing her for some unknown transgression. One rainy evening, Amora knelt before the village shrine, a small stone altar where the villagers offered sacrifices to the gods. She wept quietly, her heart full of grief, her hands raised in prayer. Great Acorn, Sky God, I have nothing left but my faith. Grant me the gift of motherhood, she whispered. That night, a strange thing happened. As the wind howled outside and lightning illuminated the sky, Amora fell into a deep, trance-like sleep. In her dream, the sky above her opened up, and a brilliant, powerful figure descended from the heavens. He was a god, Acorn himself, his form made of shimmering light, his voice thundering through the storm. Amora, the god said, his voice both gentle and terrifying, you will bear a child, but not a common child. He will be born with a great purpose. He will not speak until the time is right. And when he speaks, it will be the voice of the gods themselves. The vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Amora breathless and trembling. When she awoke, the storm had passed, and the world seemed still. Amora felt an overwhelming sense of peace, knowing that the gods had answered her prayer. But even in her joy, a sense of foreboding lingered. Months passed, and Amora's belly grew. The villagers, still skeptical, watched her closely. Some were excited for her, but others whispered behind her back. What kind of child would she bear, they wondered. How could a woman like her, who had waited so long, bear a child of destiny? The day of the birth arrived with little fanfare. The storm from Amora's dream had returned, a fierce and unrelenting downpour. Inside the hut, Amora labored through the night. The midwife worked tirelessly, but there was a strange sense of unease in the air. Finally, as dawn's light broke through the storm clouds, Amora gave birth to a healthy baby boy. But there was something wrong. The boy did not cry. Is he alive? Ibo asked, his voice shaking with fear. The midwife placed her hand over the boy's chest and nodded. He is alive. But there is no cry. This child, he's different. Amora, remembering the prophecy from the god Acorn, felt a deep certainty in her heart. He will speak when the time is right, she whispered, as if reassuring herself more than anyone else. This is the child the gods promised me. As the years passed, the village grew more and more skeptical of the boy, Kofi. He was healthy, strong, and active, but there was still no sign that he would ever speak. The other children in the village, curious at first, began to lose interest in him. They found it odd, and eventually, they began to mock him. Kofi, the mute boy, they would call him. Kofi, the dumb one. At first, Kofi would retreat into himself, sitting quietly under the shade of a tree while the other children ran and played. He could understand them perfectly, he saw the world with a sharp clarity that no one seemed to notice, but he said nothing. His silence was his only shield against the cruelty of the world. The children's teasing escalated. "Why don't you talk, Kofi?" Nia, a boy known for his cruel sense of humor, would taunt. "Maybe the gods forgot to give you a tongue." One day, the children surrounded Kofi as he sat by the river. They threw rocks at him, calling him names, demanding that he speak. But Kofi did not flinch. He simply looked at them with steady eyes, as though he could see into their hearts. His silence seemed to anger them even more, and the teasing turned physical. "Come on, speak," Nia shouted, grabbing Kofi by the arm and shaking him. "Say something, anything." Kofi stood up, his eyes fixed on Nia. For a moment, the air between them seemed to freeze. The wind picked up, and the leaves rustled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Without a word, Kofi raised his hand and touched Nia's forehead. The other children gasped, stepping back. For a moment, Kofi's hand glowed with a faint, golden light. Then, just as quickly, the light faded, and Kofi let go of Nia. Nia staggered back, his face pale. He looked around, confused and frightened. What did you do to me?" he whispered. But Kofi simply turned and walked away, his silence speaking louder than anything he could have said. Weeks later, the village was struck by a terrible illness. It began with the elders, who fell ill one by one, their bodies racked with fever and pain. The village healers could do little to help. The sickness spread rapidly, and soon, even the youngest children were bedridden. Desperate, Amora sought out Kofi. He had not spoken a word since the day by the river, but she had a feeling that her son's silence held the key to saving the village. "Kofi, the village is dying. The elders, the children, everyone is sick. You must do something," she pleaded. Kofi, as always, said nothing. He simply walked to the center of the village, where the sick lay in their huts, their families weeping at their sides. Kofi moved from person to person, silently kneeling beside them. He placed his hands on their foreheads, his fingers warm and steady. As he touched each person, a strange, golden light seemed to emanate from his hands. The villagers watched in awe, not knowing what to think. Was this the power of the gods? Could this boy truly heal the sick with nothing but his touch? By the following morning, the fever had broken. Those who had been bedridden were able to sit up, their strength returning. The children, once pale and weak, were now laughing and playing again. Word of Kofi's miraculous healing spread like wildfire. People from nearby villages began to flock to Okrom, seeking his help. But not everyone was convinced. Some villagers still mocked him, calling him a charlatan or a trickster. How can a mute boy heal the sick, they wondered. But Amora knew the truth. Her son was not just a boy, he was the voice of the gods. As Kofi's fame grew, so did the challenges. He had begun to heal not only the sick but also those who had lost hope, those who were broken in spirit. But with each miracle, Kofi felt a deep weariness in his heart. The gods had blessed him with power, but what was the cost? What price would he have to pay for this gift? One night, as Kofi sat alone by the river, pondering these questions, he heard a voice in the wind. It was Akon, the god who had promised him this destiny. "You are powerful, Kofi," the voice said. "But do not forget that with great power comes great sacrifice. You must choose, continue to heal and save the people, but risk losing yourself in the process, or turn away from your destiny and live a life of silence forever." Kofi stood in the darkness, his heart heavy. He knew the god's words were not to be taken lightly. But he also knew that the villagers depended on him. His silence had become his greatest strength, and now, it was time for him to make a choice. The moon hung low over the village, casting long shadows across the ground. Kofi sat alone by the river, his mind lost in thought. The words of Akon echoed in his ears, repeating like a drumbeat in his chest. With great power comes great sacrifice. But what did that sacrifice mean? Would the gods ask him to abandon his healing? Would they ask him to give up his very life? The answer seemed to elude him, and yet, deep within, Kofi could feel that something was changing. The village had begun to thrive once more, but the miracles had started to take a toll on him. Every time he healed someone, his body grew weaker, as though the energy it took to mend others drained him of his own life force. The elders, the children, even the animals, each had been restored, but Kofi himself was beginning to feel the weight of their salvation. That night, as the wind whispered through the trees, Kofi's body began to ache. It wasn't the usual fatigue that followed healing. No, this was different, more profound, more unsettling. His vision blurred, and his breath became shallow. The world around him seemed to tilt as if the very earth beneath him was losing its balance. Suddenly, a light appeared before him, faint at first, like the shimmer of moonlight on water. As Kofi squinted into the glow, the figure of Akon materialized before him, tall and radiant, a being of pure light. "You have begun to feel the weight of your gifts, Kofi," Akon's voice boomed, vibrating through the earth itself. "The power you wield is not without cost. Your strength is drawn from the very essence of the world around you." Kofi's heart pounded in his chest, and he struggled to find his voice. "I don't understand," he thought, feeling the depth of Akon's presence. "Why is this happening to me?" Akon smiled, a serene, knowing expression on his face. "The gods gave you this gift for a reason, Kofi. But you are not the only one who has made sacrifices. Every time you heal, you take on a piece of the suffering. It is a bond between you and the world, a bond that, if left unchecked, will drain you completely." Kofi felt a chill in the air as the full weight of Akon's words sunk in. He had known there would be consequences, but the idea that his powers came at such a personal cost was terrifying. "Then what am I to do?" Kofi whispered, his voice barely a breath. "I cannot stop healing. The people need me." Akon's expression softened, and his voice grew gentler. "You must find balance, Kofi. You have been chosen, but you are also a part of this world. The gods cannot protect you forever. If you do not learn to temper your powers, you may lose yourself in the process." The light around Akon began to fade, and his figure dissolved into the air like mist before dawn. Kofi was left alone by the river, the weight of his dilemma pressing down on him. He could hear the distant sounds of the village, the laughter of children, the voices of those he had healed. But even in the midst of the peace he had created, Kofi could feel the growing darkness inside him, a hunger he didn't understand. He knew now that his healing was not just a gift, it was a curse. And with each life he saved, a piece of his own soul slipped away. The days following Akon's visit were filled with a sense of urgency and fear. Kofi tried to continue healing the sick and injured, but each time he did, the exhaustion grew worse. His body trembled after each healing session, and sometimes, he found it difficult to stand. But even as Kofi grappled with the consequences of his gift, the village seemed to flourish. People who had once been weak and sickly were now strong. Crops grew taller, animals bred with greater vitality, and the river, which had once been erratic and shallow, flowed with more abundance. Word spread quickly that Kofi was a healer beyond compare. It wasn't long before outsiders began arriving in Okrom, seeking the miraculous boy who had the power to cure all ailments. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange figure appeared at the village's edge. Cloaked in dark, tattered robes, the figure moved with an eerie silence, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The villagers watched in hushed whispers as the figure walked toward the center of the village. Kofi, who had been sitting by the fire, watching the stars, noticed the stranger's approach. His intuition told him that something was different about this person. He felt the weight of the stranger's presence, a heaviness that made the air feel thick.
Kindly like and subscribe.
The stranger approached Kofi, and the villagers parted to let him pass. Without a word, the cloaked figure reached into his robe and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. He handed it to Kofi. Kofi took the box cautiously, his hands trembling. The box was cold to the touch, and as his fingers brushed against it, a strange energy seemed to pulse through him, sending a ripple of unease down his spine. "Open it," the stranger said, his voice low and gravelly. Kofi hesitated but finally unlatched the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft cloth, was a small, gleaming stone. The stone was a deep shade of red, its surface smooth and almost alive, as if it were pulsing with a hidden energy. The villagers gasped. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Some murmured that it was a gift from the gods, while others whispered that it was a dangerous artifact. But Kofi felt only confusion and unease. The stranger looked at Kofi with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "That stone," the man said softly, "is the key to your true power. It will grant you strength, but at a price you cannot yet understand." Kofi stared at the stone, his mind swirling with questions. What did he mean by true power? What price? Before Kofi could speak, the stranger turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows of the night. "You will understand soon enough," he called over his shoulder. "The gods are not what they seem." Days passed, and Kofi could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. The stone lay in his hands, heavy with a power he could not control. It pulsed in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat, and every time he touched it, he felt a surge of energy that left him weak and disoriented. His body was still drained from his healing, and now this new weight, this mysterious stone, seemed to draw even more from him. Kofi went to the river, hoping to clear his mind. The stone burned in his pocket, and he pulled it out, staring at it beneath the moonlight. It seemed to glow, casting eerie shadows across his face. He felt a pull, an irresistible urge to understand what it truly was. As he held the stone, the world around him shifted. The river, the trees, the village, they all seemed to blur, as though he were seeing them through a veil of mist. Then, like a tide crashing against the shore, visions began to flood his mind. He saw the gods, their faces shrouded in light, watching him from a distance. He saw the lives he had healed, the faces of the people who depended on him. But among them, he saw something else, something dark. The stone was not a gift. It was a tool, a weapon forged to bind him to a greater, more dangerous power. It was the key to unlocking an ancient force that the gods had kept hidden for centuries. Suddenly, the vision stopped, and Kofi collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His head throbbed, and his heart raced. He had glimpsed something terrible. The stone was not meant to heal, it was meant to control. And the stranger who had given it to him was not a messenger of the gods, he was a harbinger of something far darker. Kofi looked up at the night sky, his mind reeling. What have I become?
What next? Thanks for watching.